Welcome once again to Military Motor Pool. I'm Tom Townsend. This is a program all about military vehicles, collecting, restoring, and keeping them rolling. Because when we preserve some of these, we're not just preserving bits of history, we're honoring the men and the women of all nations who had the courage to ride them into harm's way. Dodge trucks are probably the second most collectible of all military vehicles, second only to the Jeep. They're larger than Jeeps, but most are still small enough to fit into a home garage. They also have enough space to carry all the gear for long trips. Although they're simple and primitive, they're comfortable to drive, at least by World War II standards. At worst, they may feel a little heavy or underpowered. Their top speed's only 45 miles an hour, so don't take one on the freeway. But in general, they share no common faults. And while it borders on the impossible to sleep comfortably in a Jeep, Dodges have plenty of room to camp.
Oh, good morning, boys. I slept real good last night.
And off-road, as long as there is enough space between the trees, they will keep going. John and Horace Dodge introduced their first vehicle in 1914, and less than a year later they began building staff cars, trucks, and ambulances for the U.S. Army in World War I. Now, when World War II came along, Dodge built close to 400,000 trucks, of which 225,000 were the WC series you see here. Now, one might assume that WC stood for weapons carrier, since that became the common name for all of the open cab models. But not true. W actually was a Dodge product code for 1941, and C stood for half-ton.
What? That still doesn't make any sense to me.
You're right, it doesn't. But here's what happened. In 1941, Dodge had introduced a series of half-ton military trucks. With the outbreak of World War II, it was decided to upgrade to a heavier, three-quarter-ton rated vehicle, which kept 80% of the same parts used on the half-ton. Hence the W for 1941 and the C for half-ton parts. And the three-quarter-ton weapons carrier was born. This is the WC-51, the most common model, of which 123,500 were built. All were open cab models and could be fitted with a machine gun mount which bolted across the front of the bed to carry either the Browning 30 or 50 caliber machine gun. The powertrain consists of a 4-speed transmission and a D-clutch lever for engaging four-wheel drive. One rather unique feature of the weapons carriers is a spare tire mount. The bad news here is the driver can't get in or out the left side of the vehicle without climbing over it.
Well, that's dumb. It must have been designed by a man. Okay, what's the good news?
The good news is it's heavy steel. Stopped a lot of lead and shrapnel. In 1941, the Army increased the size of its infantry rifle squad from 8 to 12 men. And this meant there was no longer enough room for them and all their gear in a three-quarter-ton truck. So Dodge extended the frame on the WC-51, added a tandem rear axle, and created the 1.5-ton 6x6 WC-62. This WC-62 was owned by Mike Gamble. Mike, thanks for allowing us to showcase your vehicle. Appreciate it. So where'd this vehicle come from?
Actually, Tom, this vehicle came from Norway. It was brought back into the country in roughly 1980. It was actually a veteran, went over during the war, was built in 1943, transported over to Europe, and fought through the Europe engagement. After that time, it was given to the Norwegian Army, and they kept it until it was brought back into the United States by a collector. I received it from a fella up in Corsicana, Texas, and when I got it, it was running, but it had some front damage on it. It was not very pretty and was an incomplete unit. So I spent about a year cleaning it up, replacing the back end of it, working on the engine, transmission, differential, repainting it, put all new hood numbers and everything on it, and got it as you see today.
When we come back, we're going to take a look at the Dodge Command Car and the general who made it famous.
There's several people who have recreated the character of General Patton, but none have done it quite as successfully as Denny Hare. Besides just creating the character again, you've gone a whole lot further. You've created the whole 3rd Army headquarters back here, modified some vehicles. What all else have you done besides simply assuming the persona?
Our first large project was do something no one had done. We recreated his headquarters van. It was a sleeping van, and it was his mobile headquarters. He had map board and radios and phones, and he commanded from that. He was a mobile command station. So we recreated that based on what still exists, the original, at the Fort Knox Museum. So that was a couple-of-year project. And then Fort Knox saw it, and then they said, why don't we redo ours? So when they get through with theirs, they're going to get back with us, and then we'll redo ours again, so it'll be perfect. And ours will be the one that goes around the country, and theirs will be the one that sits at the museum. So we have a good relationship with the Patton Museum at Fort Knox. So we all are trying to do the same thing, and we're working together. The other thing that was modified is the command car. I've been looking for years for the correct model with a winch, which is a WC-57. Found one in Livernia. Bill Wiseman had it for some time. He meant to restore it, never could, so we worked a deal. And I modified it exactly as the Ordnance Department had modified General Patton's vehicle. So that's been another year doing that.
All right, let's take a look at what those modifications were, because General Patton was very specific about what he wanted on his vehicles.
He was, and he had reasons for everything that he did.
All right, let's see what he did here.
All right, the first thing that's obvious that is different is the armored plating shield that's at the front of it. It swivels, and it's designed to catch shrapnel or something that was shot directly at it and keep it away from the radiator. Also, by sloping armor, it actually increases the thickness that it has to go through. He knew that it wouldn't stop bullets, but if he could deflect them all. And he was also, from North Africa on, he was very close to the fighting when he visited the front, and shells would explode. And he had shells and shrapnel. In fact, his aide was killed not far from him in North Africa. So that was an important point. He also knew that since this was modified for Europe and going into 3rd Army, he also knew there's a lot of mines. So the back end down below his seat had 1 inch or 1/2 inch armor plating. And we didn't do that to this because there's no need for it today, but the original does. He believed in being seen at the front, so he had his signature air horns, which he was the only general in the theater that had air horns. And you could hear him coming and coming and coming, miles away. Also, he had a siren that was also his signature. So you could hear his entourage coming and the MPs. It was part of the pomp and circumstances. People think, well, that's his ego. It wasn't his ego. He wanted the men to know he was there. He wanted to see them to know that the commanding general was up front with them. And that was important to him. He also wanted to show that there was no reason to fear the enemy. So he was highly marked. He had his stars where you could see them. He was a 3rd Army commander, and he had his flag all made out of metal and very pomp and circumstance. But it wasn't the ego. It was to show his men that he could take this out in the field. Because a lot of times they had heard, well, the snipers are going to shoot the highest ranking officer, they're going to shoot the officer, so they'd be covering their rank. And he said, no, you're a leader, lead. And then he decided also that he knew the silhouette of this was unique. And it was either going to be a command of reconnaissance or it would have a high-ranking officer in it. And the Luftwaffe would fly over and they know exactly what it was, so he knew it was the target. But rather than get in a Jeep like a lot of the commanders did, he said, no, we're going to go in a command car. So he mounted a 50 caliber machine gun on the side so he could protect himself in case he was shot at by the Luftwaffe. Then finally, by its nature, a WC-57 has no trunk space. You can put a jack in there and maybe some tools, and that's just about it. So the next thing that he had modified was a tailgate on the back. and he took it from a weapons carrier. And all these parts were taken from a huge bend in England that had all the things that had been bombed out, and they were used just for parts, and so they just modified these parts. The Ordnance Department who modified it, they had a sense of history. So they took pictures of the modifications. Had they not done that, we would have never known how it was modified and why. So we took the original photographs that we got from the Smithsonian, not from the Smithsonian, from the National Archives, and followed it to a T. So that it would be exactly the way that he had. And we even went as far as putting leather seats in it, which the originals had. Today they put canvas or a vinyl seat, which looks like leather. But I think if I'm going to go to this much trouble, I'm just going to go ahead and do it right. So that's pretty how it was modified.
Okay. I know you've not only done Patton in this country, but you also got to go to Germany and do it.
The Army called me and asked me if I would go to Heidelberg, Germany, to the hospital that he was killed. And for the 64th anniversary of his death, I was there at the medical hospital now. It's still in operation, the same hospital that they took him to in 1945 in the car accident. And I visited the room where he passed away. And then for the hospital staff and the soldiers coming through, we did a Patton presentation, and I was as Patton. And we had people from the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg come and historians, and we went through Patton's life and what all he did, up to and including his tragic accident. And then from there, we went and visited Mannheim, where he actually had the accident, and marked the spot, and we put wreath there. And you see, even though the public knows about General Patton, the military honors him. He is probably the finest, if not the finest, military combat commander that the United States had ever produced. There's certainly not anybody that they can point to that was better. Maybe there's some on an equal. And despite his faults personally, and despite his no politics and making people angry, on the field he was feared. The Germans feared him. He was the most feared commander that we had on any side. And so they honor him. They honor that memory. And the tactics and the things that he developed in World War II is still being used today. Critton Abrams, who was in the 4th Armored Division, was considered one of Patton's finest tank commanders. And it was from him and from his tactics that Critton Abrams later went on to develop armored tactics, and they even named the tank after him. So you have a succession of Patton's first tank tactics being developed into modern tank tactics by people who served under him in the next generation and the next generation. So he's the father of modern armored tactics.
Hidden away in a forgotten bunker may be the most terrifying, indestructible wonder weapon of World War II.
Of course they was indestructible. We built them.
For over 60 years, the story of these evil machines remained shrouded in mystery and legend.
But now they are out. And with them we will conquer the world.
They were born of a fatal mixture of technology and magic. Now, at last, their story can be told.
If only we had a few more like you, we would have won the war.
Evil Toy Tanks, a new book by award-winning Texas author Tom Townsend. Not to be taken seriously.
Welcome back to Military Motor Pool. Today we've been looking at the World War II Dodge trucks, and one of the most interesting variants, also possibly the most famous, is a WC-54 ambulance. We caught up with Charles Varner, who's a serious military vehicle collector, former president of the MVPA, and he owns this WC-54.
This was the very first World War II vehicle I undertook to restore, and I wouldn't recommend it because it's probably one of the most difficult that you can set out on. However, it was a challenge. When I got it, it was in good running condition, and the Wayne Body Works body was in relatively good shape. What the ambulance has that makes it so difficult is the fact that it does have so much body work. It's a thin-skinned vehicle. It's got this amazing body work, including what goes up here, all the design of it. It's got doors that close. And I think even beyond that, it's the interior parts and equipment that goes in an ambulance. It's got special everything you don't find in any other military vehicle. It has an overhead light in the back that was specific to this vehicle. It has special hooks to hang IVs on, special hooks and straps for the litters. It has a special fold-down bench in the back for wounded that could actually be sitting up. So instead of carrying 4 wounded on a litter, strap 2 of them from the ceiling, 2 on the floor, you fold down some bench seats in the back on either side, you can carry up to perhaps 8 to 10 wounded, even more. I know of one guy in Korea told me the ambulance was full and he was badly wounded, and he wound up actually hanging on to the front fender of the vehicle until they made it back to the aid station. The second thing that makes this vehicle extremely difficult, other than the amount of body work, much like a classic car, you have to take it to a body shop and really have it done correctly, is all the graphics and markings. And I think this is a good example here. This was unique to the ambulance. It's the Kadusha done on a field of white with the maroon color, which was the medical department, and then the United States Army type that you see here. This is not a stencil, it's actually painted onto the vehicle, and this was done at the factory. So that combined with the Red Cross, there's a large Red Cross on the top, there's smaller Red Crosses on the front, not to mention all the normal World War II military vehicle markings. It makes it a very difficult job to paint the vehicle. Luckily, I'm an artist, graphic designer, so I had the tools and the experience to go about doing this. So having said that, it's a very rewarding vehicle. I probably should mention too, I bought this in 1989, so it was many years ago. It was also one of the less expensive vehicles at the time. I think since then, ambulances have a little more respect now. Of course, they're Dodges, they're big, they're powerful, they're interesting, and I think that's probably one of the main things about it that makes it such a fun vehicle to have.
The ambulance, or ambulances in general, kind of seem like a niche market to me. Some collectors really like them, and an awful lot of them seem to have no interest. I wonder if that's perhaps because this was the one vehicle you did not want to end up in the back of.
I think that could be. I mean, sometimes there is association. I once had a friend who'd actually grown up on an Air Force base who, every time I went by her house, she became emotionally upset because she always associated this, you know, with casualties and problems and things like that. And as you say, this is a niche market. But there are people that are very interested, you know, in the medical corps or the role the ambulances play. It's all part of the history of World War II, and this is certainly an unusual and interesting vehicle. Consequently, there haven't been as many of them preserved, I think, simply because of that. This one, interestingly enough, was in a mining company up in Colorado. So often after the war, these heavy-duty Dodge trucks and other trucks were put into that sort of service. But I think strictly from a standpoint of maybe thinking about a parade or something, you can only put 2 people in this vehicle effectively. And even at that, you're not seen very well. I know in Texas, the fact that it's a closed vehicle makes it quite hot, but there could be cases in a climate where it's cold and wet. This would be the perfect vehicle. And plus, as you say, you can camp in the back, so it's a good convoy vehicle, something you can get a lot of use out of. So it's a, I guess, all-encompassing type vehicle. So.
Right.
Following World War II, Dodge replaced the WC-54 with the upgraded and improved M43 ambulance, and it remained in service well into the 1970s. But that's another story for another show. So until then, from the staff at Military Motor Pool and from all our friends who helped to make this show possible, so long and let's keep 'em rolling.